Every day, millions of Americans walk into a pizza shop. They smell the sauce. They hear the dough slapping against the counter. They watch the cheese bubble under the heat of the oven. They think nothing of it. But for nearly a decade, from 1975 to 1984, walking into the wrong pizza shop in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, or Wisconsin meant walking into something else entirely. The front counter was real. The pizza was real. The ovens were real. But somewhere in the back, behind the kitchen, behind the walk-in refrigerator, behind the entirely ordinary smell of a family restaurant, was a distribution hub for the largest heroin pipeline in American history. $1.6 billion worth of heroin moved through pizza shops, hidden inside cans of San Marzano tomatoes, shipped from the poppy fields of Turkey, processed in secret Sicilian laboratories, smuggled across the Atlantic, and distributed through a network of approximately 200 Italian-American restaurants stretching from Queens to Chicago. For 9 years, nobody stopped it, because nobody thought to look inside the tomato cans. Picture this moment first. July 12, 1979, Knickerbocker Avenue, Bushwick, Brooklyn. A man named Carmine Galante is eating lunch on the back patio of a restaurant called Joe and Mary's. He is 69 years old, boss of the Bonanno crime family. Cigar permanently clamped between his teeth. A man so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own untouchability, that he eats outside on a summer afternoon, with minimal security. 3 men in ski masks walk through the restaurant. They come out the back. They open fire. Galante dies on the patio. Cigar still in his mouth. 2 things happen in the aftermath of that murder that will eventually set in motion the largest drug investigation in American history. The first, surveillance footage from 30 minutes after the shooting shows a Bonanno soldier being congratulated by a Gambino family underboss. The commission had ordered the hit. Galante had become too dangerous, too greedy, too independent. The second, the Sicilian faction Galante had brought into the Bonanno family to run his heroin operation. They are still in place, still operating, still moving product through a network that Galante built but no longer controls. With their patron dead, they answer to no one. And with no one watching, they expand everything. But to understand why Galante died on that patio, and what his death unleashed, we have to go back to Sicily, and a route that had been running since before most of the men who died for it were born. Before the pizza connection, there was the French connection, the greatest heroin trafficking operation in American history up to that point. Turkish opium processed into heroin in Marseille, in laboratories controlled by the Corsican underworld, smuggled into the United States through a network that supplied New York's estimated 400,000 heroin addicts for decades. In 1971, the French connection was broken, not completely, not permanently, but significantly enough that the supply chain tightened and prices spiked, and the men at the top of New York's heroin distribution network found themselves staring at a gap in the market that needed filling. Someone had to replace the Corsicans. The Sicilian Mafia had been watching. They had the relationships. They had the infrastructure. They had the laboratories hidden in farmhouses and warehouse districts across the Palermo countryside, capable of processing the Turkish morphine base that was the raw material of the entire operation. And they had something the Corsicans never fully had: an American distribution network built into the existing social fabric of Italian immigrant communities, not street corners, not criminal fronts, legitimate family businesses that nobody would ever look at twice, pizza shops. Carmine Galante had understood the opportunity before anyone else. In the early 1970s, freshly paroled from prison after a 12-year narcotics sentence, he began importing Sicilian Mafia members directly into the Bonanno family structure. Young men from the old country, men who had been made in Sicily and were now operating under an American family's umbrella. His associates called them the Zips, a slang term, the origins disputed, used to describe Sicilian-born mobsters operating in America. Tight, secretive, operating in their own language, loyal first to Sicily, to each other, and to whoever was currently providing them operational cover. Galante provided that cover. In exchange, the Zips provided him something more valuable than loyalty: a direct pipeline to Sicilian heroin. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Sicilian Mafia bosses, particularly those aligned with the powerful Corleonesi clan that was then consolidating control of the Palermo underworld, had access to Turkish morphine base through suppliers in Bulgaria, Switzerland, and the Middle East. They had the laboratories to process it into heroin. They had the shipping infrastructure to move it. What they needed was a distribution network on the American end. Galante gave them the Bonanno family's existing criminal infrastructure and something new: the pizzerias. Here is how it actually worked, step by step, continent by continent. It started in Turkey. Farmers in the Afyon region and other poppy-producing areas of Anatolia harvested opium gum from their fields. That raw material was purchased through intermediaries, through layers of brokers who maintained distance between the mafia and the source, by Sicilian traffickers operating through Switzerland. The morphine base made its way to Sicily, specifically to Palermo and its surrounding provinces, where laboratories hidden behind the facades of ordinary buildings converted it into heroin of extraordinary purity. The chemists who ran these labs were brought from Marseille, veterans of the French Connection era who now worked under new management. The finished heroin was packaged. Then it disappeared into the legitimate supply chain of Italian food products destined for export to the United States. Here is the detail that still stops investigators cold when they talk about this case. The heroin was hidden inside cans of San Marzano tomatoes, whole, peeled tomatoes in their own juice, the standard product of dozens of Italian food companies. Shipped by the container load to Italian restaurants and grocery suppliers across the eastern United States. Nobody x-rayed tomato cans at the port of entry. Nobody swabbed them for trace narcotics. Nobody thought to question why a pizza shop in rural Wisconsin was importing San Marzano tomatoes directly from a supplier in Palermo rather than buying them from a domestic food distributor. The tomatoes arrived. The cans were opened in the back of the shop. The heroin was extracted. The tomatoes were reportedly actually used to make sauce. The pizza was real. The cover was perfect. From the pizzerias, the heroin moved outward into street-level distribution networks. Packaged, sold, the cash collected, counted in the back rooms of the same shops where the product had arrived. And then the money had to go somewhere. $1.6 billion in cash is a problem. Not just because of its volume, though the physical weight of that much paper money is genuinely staggering, but because cash with no documented source cannot enter the legitimate financial system without triggering questions that nobody running a heroin pipeline wants to answer. The Pizza Connection's money laundering operation was as sophisticated as its smuggling network. Cash generated at the pizzeria distribution hubs was collected and moved to central counting points in New York. From there, it moved through a web of currency exchange businesses, brokerage accounts, and offshore banking relationships that spanned Switzerland, the Bahamas, Brazil, and Italy. One of the primary conduits was a money broker named Franco Della Torre, operating out of Switzerland. Cash delivered to his contacts in New York would be credited in Swiss accounts within days, the physical dollars moving through one channel while the electronic credit moved through another. Clean money emerging at the Swiss end, dirty money consumed and converted at the American end. The operation used some of America's largest and most respected brokerage firms as unwitting intermediaries. E.F. Hutton, Merrill Lynch, account holders with legitimate-looking names and transaction histories. Money moving through in volumes that individually didn't trigger suspicion, collectively representing hundreds of millions of dollars in laundered drug proceeds. The men running the money operation communicated primarily through payphones, public phones on street corners in Brooklyn and Queens. Conversations conducted in a code built around the Sicilian dialect, a language that New York's FBI field office had almost no capacity to interpret in real time. The code was simple. Heroin was referred to as shirts. Shirts of various colors indicated purity and quantity. Money was suits. A meeting was a fitting. The tailor shop was open for 9 years before anyone understood what was being tailored. In 1876, while the Pizza Connection was already running at full capacity, the FBI inserted an undercover agent into the Bonanno crime family. His name was Joseph Pistone. His cover name was Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief, a man with connections who was looking to do business. For 6 years, from 1976 to 1981, Pistone lived inside the Bonanno family. He attended meetings. He socialized with made members. He was trusted to a degree that by the end of his operation, he was within weeks of being formally inducted as a full member of the family. He was pulled out before that could happen. What he brought out with him was the intelligence that cracked the case open. He had observed the Sicilian faction operating within the Bonanno structure. He had noticed the insularity, the way the Zips maintained their own social world, conducted their own meetings, operated with a secrecy that even other Bonanno members couldn't penetrate. He had heard the references to large sums of cash moving through channels nobody was supposed to discuss. He had met Salvatore Catalano. Catalano was the operational leader of the Sicilian faction in New York. On paper, the owner of Catalano Brothers Bakery in Middle Village, Queens. A suburban business in a neighborhood so ordinary it barely registered as a location worth surveilling. Behind the bakery, the nerve center of the American end of the Pizza Connection. Pistone's intelligence gave FBI agents a name and a location to start from. What they built from that starting point took 4 years and touched 13 countries. In 1980, the FBI's New York field office began building the case in earnest. The challenge was the payphones. The Sicilian faction communicated almost exclusively on public phones. The calls were short, the language was coded, the locations changed constantly. Traditional wiretapping, which required a fixed installation on a known line, was nearly useless. So investigators installed pen registers on dozens of payphones across Brooklyn and Queens. Electronic devices that recorded every number dialed from every phone. The data was collected daily, analyzed, cross-referenced. Patterns emerged. Certain phones calling certain numbers at certain times. That began to map the communication network of the entire operation. Physical surveillance teams followed the key figures. Catalano's bakery was watched around the clock. Agents photographed every visitor, every vehicle, every delivery. The surveillance photos eventually documented a meeting that cracked the conspiracy's international dimension wide open. In 1980, agents photographed a gathering in Pizzerias, Sicily. A meeting that included Salvatore Catalano alongside the most significant Sicilian Mafia bosses of the era. The photograph placed the American Bonanno faction at the same table as the Sicilian Cosa Nostra's leadership. The connection was documented, literally, in a photograph. The investigation expanded internationally. Italian authorities, Spanish police, Swiss banking regulators, German law enforcement, Brazilian authorities tracking money flows. By 1982, when the FBI received concurrent narcotics jurisdiction with the DEA, the investigation was already a 4-year operation with no clear end in sight. Thousands of hours of recorded conversations, hundreds of surveillance photographs, a financial trail that wound through 11 countries. The arrest trigger came not from the American investigation, but from Madrid. From April 8, 1984, Spanish police arrested Gaetano Badalamenti, the former boss of the Sicilian Mafia Commission, exiled from Sicily after a power struggle with the Corleonesi faction, now living in Spain and still directing shipments through the American network, along with his son and a nephew. The domino fell. Within 24 hours, the FBI arrested nearly 30 people simultaneously across New York City. Weapons were seized. Drugs were seized. The operation that had run invisibly for 9 years was suddenly visible everywhere at once. September 30th, 1985. A federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. 22 defendants. All Sicilian-born. Charged with operating a criminal enterprise that had imported $1.6 billion worth of heroin into the United States over 9 years. The lead prosecutor was a young assistant U.S. attorney named Louis Freeh. He would later become the director of the FBI. The evidence was staggering in its volume. 55,000 wiretap conversations, 300 witnesses, testimony from Italian judges, Spanish police officers, Swiss banking regulators, Turkish law enforcement officials, surveillance photographs from 4 continents, financial records tracing money through 11 countries. 2 key witnesses changed the case's trajectory. Tommaso Buscetta, a senior Sicilian Mafia figure who had become an informant after the Corleonesi faction, murdered 17 of his relatives in Sicily's brutal internal war. He provided testimony about the Sicilian side of the operation that no law enforcement agency had previously been able to document. And Joseph Pistone, Donnie Brasco himself, who took the stand and testified in precise detail about what he had witnessed inside the Bonanno family during 6 years of undercover work. The trial lasted 17 months. It was the longest criminal jury trial in United States history, a record it still holds today. During those 17 months, 1 defendant was murdered, a victim of tensions between factions of the conspiracy. Another was shot and nearly killed. The violence continued even while the participants were on trial for the conspiracy that had produced it. On March 2, 1987, the jury returned. 18 convictions. Badalamenti sentenced to 45 years. Catalano sentenced to 45 years. 12 of the other defendants sentenced to terms ranging from 12 to 35 years. The FBI's New York special agent in charge called it the most significant organized crime prosecution in the history of the Bureau. Louis Freeh, decades later as FBI director, called it a historic turning point for international law enforcement cooperation, the template for every transnational criminal enterprise investigation that followed. Here is the number that puts the pizza connection in its true context. In 1982, the year the FBI formally joined the investigation, New York City had an estimated 400,000 heroin addicts, 400,000 people. In one city, dependent on a substance that the Pizza Connection was supplying in metric ton quantities through tomato cans and pizza shops. Murders in New York that year exceeded 1,600, many of them directly attributable to the drug trade. The Pizza Connection didn't create New York's heroin epidemic, but it fed it. Systematically, industrially, with a supply chain so reliable and a distribution network so deeply embedded in the legitimate food industry that disrupting it required 4 years, 13 countries, 55,000 wiretaps, and the longest trial in American legal history. Every overdose, every death, every family destroyed by addiction in those 9 years had a supply chain behind it that ran through a pizza shop. The men who built that supply chain ate lunch in those same shops, made phone calls from the payphone on the corner, went home to their families in the suburbs of Queens and New Jersey, lived lives that from the outside looked entirely ordinary. Behind the counter, tomato cans that had crossed the Atlantic. Behind the sauce, a supply chain that had killed more Americans than most wars. The Pizza Connection ran for 9 years. It moved $1.6 billion worth of heroin through the American food supply chain. It fed an addiction crisis that devastated an entire generation of New Yorkers. It connected the Sicilian Mafia, the Turkish opium trade, and the American criminal underworld into a single functioning machine that operated in plain sight for nearly a decade. And it was built on the simplest possible insight. The best place to hide something nobody is supposed to see is inside something everybody expects to ignore. Nobody suspects a pizza shop. Nobody x-rays a tomato can. Nobody thinks to question why a restaurant in Wisconsin is importing ingredients from a supplier in Palermo. The men who designed the Pizza Connection understood something fundamental about the nature of concealment. You don't hide in the shadows. You hide in the light. You put your operation inside the most ordinary business in the most ordinary neighborhood in America, and you make very good pizza. The operation is gone. The defendants are dead or served their sentences. The FBI's investigation set the template for every transnational criminal enterprise prosecution that came after it. But the lesson the Pizza Connection taught has never stopped being applied. The next criminal pipeline hiding inside the next ordinary business is already running. The tomato cans just look different now. The Pizza Connection showed how the American Mafia built empires by hiding in plain sight. But hiding in plain sight wasn't invented in the 1970s. Decades earlier, a man named Lucky Luciano built a criminal empire inside the most visible and least suspected business in New York City. Next, how Luciano turned New York brothels into a $100 million mafia cash machine.